Imagine yourself adrift in the vast ocean, with no land in sight and surrounded by deep waters and dangerous creatures. For these people, what started as an ordinary day has turned into a fight for survival. Follow below. After a night of fun on a luxury cruise, a man wakes up on the open sea completely alone. Now he will have to use all his physical and mental resistance to not succumb to fear and despair, and wait for help. 3 friends become targets of a great white shark after being left adrift, one of the deadliest attacks on record. A terrifying ordeal that would become the basis for danger on the high seas. One of the most intense shark films ever created. 5 people aboard a luxury, yet are thrown overboard, and have only a small boat to stay alive. Around them, dozens of sharks circle, ready to attack at any moment. In November 2022, in New Orleans, United States, James Michael Grimes and 18 other family members were about to board the luxury cruise Carnival Valor. A 28-year-old construction worker, Michael and his family were planning a relaxing Thanksgiving trip to Cozumel, Mexico. On the night of November 23rd, James was with his sister in a game room. It was the first night on the ship. He had a few beers and wine, and even won a free drink after winning an air guitar competition. Around 11 o'clock, James told his sister he was going to the bathroom and disappeared. No one ever knew what happened to him after he left the lounge. Michael woke up in the middle of the ocean, completely alone. When he regained consciousness, he realized he was in open water with no boats in sight. It seemed to be the early morning, and James had to make a huge effort to keep his head above the water. Staying afloat in open water is much harder than it seems. Even in a deep pool or calm beach, floating requires skill to relax the body, maintain a regular breath, and balance your weight. In the open ocean, however, the conditions are much more challenging. The waves, the currents, and the cold temperatures can drain your energy quickly. Additionally, the psychological impact of facing the vastness of the ocean can be devastating. It wasn't just James's physical body that was at risk, but also his mind. At some point, James chewed on a piece of wood he found floating in the water, something that seemed to be bamboo. It was enough to offer some flavor to his mouth, apart from the constant salt. In the following hours, swarms of jellyfish stung his legs and arms, further increasing his suffering. As time passed, still on that day, the sun began to set, and the water seemed to grow colder. James wondered how much longer he would have to endure this situation. At one point, he felt something touch his legs and tried not to imagine what kind of creatures might be beneath his feet. However, occasionally, he spotted fins nearby. To preserve his sanity, he began to convince himself that they were just illusions, perhaps delusions caused by hunger and dehydration. During the night, under the light of the stars and the moon, his thoughts turned to his family, his parents, his siblings, and especially his 9-year-old daughter. These thoughts were what kept his willpower strong enough to keep fighting. Suddenly, he spotted the lights of a large ship in the distance. Without thinking twice, he used his last burst of energy and strength to swim toward what seemed like his salvation. He began waving desperately, trying to do something that might catch attention. When the spotlight finally hit him, he felt an immense relief. Grimes was rescued. The rescue took place on the 24th, after he had been adrift for just over 18 hours. According to the Coast Guard, he was not severely injured. The quick rescue was likely the main reason for his survival. James spent many hours in the water, but he did not have to face cold nights, which could have been fatal. Later, in interviews, he said that he needed to survive and held on to that determination. He believed he had probably passed out in the water for a period before regaining consciousness. "The Lord was with me while I was there, because something held me the whole time I was unconscious," he said. The sharks also didn't attack him. James felt he had a duty to survive. It was his sister who reported his disappearance after she couldn't find him the next morning. This led Carnival and the U.S. Coast Guard to initiate an extensive search. Grimes revealed that his biggest fear was drowning. He kept a positive mindset, focusing solely on continuing to swim to keep his head above the water. After the rescue, Grimes spent 5 days recovering in the ICU. Without health insurance, he faced high medical bills. His sister started a GoFundMe campaign to raise donations and cover the expenses. In interviews, James said, "It wasn't my time to die. It's a miracle I survived. I'm grateful to see my family again. In 1983, in Townsville, Australia, a small crew aboard the fishing boat New Venture set out with the intention of heading toward the Great Barrier Reef. The crew consisted of Captain Ray Boundy, 28, and his friends, Sailor Dennis Patrick Murphy, 24, and his girlfriend, Linda and Horton, 21. Ray was living his best life. Despite his young age, he was well known for his competence and experience. The trip had been planned as a shrimp fishing expedition. Upon boarding, they began their journey to an area between Townsville and the Great Barrier Reef in the Coral Sea. Ray intended to spend a few days in the area, drawn by the abundance of fish and the rich marine life. The waters were typically calm and peaceful. The voyage wasn't long, and when they arrived, the first 2 days were filled with joy and successful fishing. However, one Sunday night, a strong and unexpected storm began to violently shake the boat. They were miles away from Townsville and decided to wait for the winds to calm. By midnight, the situation had not improved. Suddenly, a large wave struck the boat, causing it to start flooding. Another even bigger wave capsized it completely. The three were thrown into the water and ended up clinging to the overturned hull of the boat. Sitting there, they tried to think of what they could do. As the hours passed, desperation began to grow. They were exhausted, cold, and had no way to call for help. All they could do was hold on and hope that someone would pass by. At dawn on Monday, Ray, Dennis, and Linda used a surfboard and a life jacket to float. They estimated they were at least 95 kilometers from the city and a little closer to the Great Barrier Reef, the largest coral reef system in the world. With the boat sinking and no sign of help, they decided to organize themselves to swim to the reef. They believed they had a better chance of being rescued there. Using the surfboard and the life jacket, they began swimming. However, without water, food, and exposed to the heat of the day, their efforts were making them more and more exhausted. Since it was an area rich in marine life, many animals crossed their path. It didn't take long before Ray, Dennis, and Linda spotted a fin in the distance. They tried to stay calm, but the danger was undeniable. It was a shark, and it appeared to be large. Immediately, they stopped swimming and avoided any sudden movements, hoping the animal would move away. But it was too late. The shark seemed too interested. Ray tried to calm them, but the adrenaline and fear were overwhelming. Suddenly, the shark disappeared. A few minutes later, the creature surfaced beneath Ray and bit his leg. He kicked with all his strength, and the animal pulled back, retreating momentarily. However, now that it had tasted blood, it wasn't going to leave. Panic set in. They knew the shark would return. All of them began to scream and thrash around, overwhelmed by fear and desperation. As evening approached, the idea of spending the night in the open ocean was terrifying. Ray was still bleeding, and the shark continued to circle them from distance. The defenseless crew was easy prey. Dennis let out a loud, desperate scream when the shark bit into his leg. Just like Ray, he tried to kick it off, but it didn't work at first. The animal dragged him underwater and shook him, then released him. Severely injured and in excruciating pain, he was losing blood rapidly, and the water around him turned red. Ray and Linda, a little farther away, tried to swim towards him. Knowing that he wouldn't survive much longer, Dennis made a decision. He told them to keep going while he stayed behind to distract the shark. He swam as fast as he could, hoping the shark would settle for him. Ray and Linda watched as he swam away, observing Dennis one last time before he was pulled under and disappeared forever. Linda screamed in despair, and Ray tried to comfort her. Both of them knew they had to maintain a steady pace if they wanted to survive. They kept swimming, and after a while, it seemed as though the creature had finally left them in peace. However, during their journey, the shark appeared once again. Ray and Linda froze in fear, knowing the nightmare was about to start all over again. Suddenly, the beast charged directly at Linda, biting her torso and dragging her underwater. Ray held onto her hand as she screamed for the last time. Her death was swift but agonizing. Everything went silent. Terrified, Ray tried to process what had just happened. In shock, he turned and swam as fast as he could toward a rocky reef he had spotted in the distance. After an exhausting day of swimming, He finally reached something he could cling to. The shark reappeared once more, but Ray managed to climb onto the reef just in time. Exhausted and deeply traumatized, he allowed his emotions to overwhelm him and began to process what had happened. He was rescued the following day. Though he continued his life as a fisherman, he never fully recovered from the intense trauma. The crew's story was so graphic and horrific that it seemed inevitable it would be made into a film. The Reef, or Peril in the Deep Sea, released in 2010, depicts 5 tourists entering the Coral Sea after their boat sinks. Fearing they'll be dragged into deeper waters by the current, the group decides to swim to a remote island, but along the way, they are attacked by a great white shark. In October 1982, in Maine, United States, an elegant yacht was about to be transported by a small crew to Florida. The sailing yacht, named Trashman, belonged to a Texas magnate who wanted his boat ready for the season. The crew included Deborah Kiley, an experienced sailor well known in professional sailing circles, along with Mark Adams and Brad Cavanaugh, both seasoned seamen. Captain John Lippeth decided to bring his girlfriend, Meg Mooney, along for the journey. The trip was expected to last only a few days, seemingly smooth, comfortable, and with no signs of trouble ahead. On the first day, the crew set sail from Maine for what was supposed to be a 6-day, 2,000-kilometer journey. Weather conditions were perfect, with stable skies and cool temperatures, allowing the crew to enjoy the moment in peace. Everything seemed to be going well, with no issues along the way. However, this calm was about to change. On the morning of the second day, complications began to arise. The latest weather forecast had not mentioned any storms, but suddenly, a violent tempest formed, striking the Trashman with powerful winds and massive waves. The crew remained in near constant contact with authorities from early morning, but at some point, Captain Lippeth lost control of the boat. He could hear the desperate screams of his crewmates as freezing water crashed in from all directions. Within minutes, the situation turned catastrophic. The engines failed, and the mainsail was badly damaged. With the yacht capsizing and sinking rapidly, their only option was to abandon the vessel. Everyone jumped into the sea, and Mark Adams managed to grab a small inflatable raft, quickly filling it with air. Just as things seemed to settle, the crew noticed something in the water. They were surrounded by sharks. Not just 2 or 3, but anywhere from 10 to 20. As they scrambled onto the raft, the creatures bumped against them, making the situation even more terrifying. Mooney, the captain's girlfriend, groaned in pain. Her leg had been severely injured at some point. The sharks began ramming the raft, sending the crew into a panic. For some reason, the small boat did not sink, and Deborah Kiley began reciting prayers, seeking strength amidst the chaos. Meg Mooney, however, remained in agony, her pain worsening with every passing moment. There was nothing they could do except survive and hope the Coast Guard would rescue them in time. As the hours passed, the storm began to stabilize into a more predictable pattern, but the threat remained ever present. On the third day, still without food or water, the survivors were severely dehydrated and extremely weak. In a desperate act, Lippeth and Adams began drinking seawater. The highly toxic salt water only accelerated dehydration and caused irreversible kidney damage. Under normal circumstances, they would never have made such a decision. Later that day, Lippeth started showing signs of hallucination, mumbling incoherent words. At one point, he became convinced he could see land. Driven by the illusion, he suddenly threw himself into the sea, too weak and stunned to react. The remaining crew could only watch him swim away. Suddenly, Lippeth let out a piercing scream that sent chills down their spines, and then he vanished. No one had any doubts about what had happened. The sharks had attacked him. Meg barely reacted to the horrific death, lost in a deep stupor caused by the combination of her severe injury and extreme dehydration. Shortly after Lippeth disappeared, Adams also began mumbling incoherently, mentioning something about going to buy cigarettes. Then, he entered the water, positioning himself next to the raft. Kiley watched in horror as sharks appeared and launched another frenzied attack. Because Adams was so close to the raft, the predators also bit into the small boat, sending the survivors into a panic. By some miracle, The raft remained afloat, but Adams met the same terrible fate as the captain. Mooney also began showing signs of hallucination, but unlike the others, she was too weak to throw herself into the sea. Her severe wound, combined with extreme dehydration, had left her gravely ill. She was dying. On the fourth day, Meg was dead. Starving, Brad Kavanaugh even considered the possibility of eating her remains to survive. However, Deborah managed to convince him to abandon the idea. Fluids from Mooney's infected wound, along with her blood, had been seeping into the raft since the second day. This deeply concerned Kylie and Brad, as they feared contracting a disease from a body. Reluctantly, they decided that the best option was to get rid of it. They didn't want to make that decision, but the circumstances forced them to. Before anything else, they undressed Mooney, keeping her clothes and jewelry as a way to return them to her family, if they survived. Then, they recited a prayer and, with heavy hearts, pushed the body overboard. Both tried to close their eyes, unable to bear the sight of the woman being consumed by the circling sharks. On the fifth day, Deborah and Brad did what they could to clean the raft, still filthy and reeking of the chaos from the previous days. However, extreme weakness and exhaustion were taking their toll. At one moment, in a careless slip, Kavanaugh lost his balance while trying to stand up and fell into the sea. Desperate, he begged Kylie to help him back up, but she simply sat there, sobbing uncontrollably on the other side of the raft, unable to react. Kavanaugh managed to climb back in on his own, exhausted and out of breath, feeling more isolated than ever. From the very beginning, through the storm and the entire harrowing ordeal, the two had made a pact to take care of each other, to protect themselves from the sharks, from madness, and even from themselves. Brad now felt completely alone, sitting in cold and uncomfortable silence. The two remained lost in their own thoughts until Kavanaugh finally broke the silence. A large ship was approaching. Throughout their journey, they had spotted a few vessels in the distance, but none had come close enough to notice them. Now, the situation was different. As the ship moved toward the raft, Brad saw a man on the deck, waving frantically. Soon after, the ship's crew threw lines with large buoys at the ends to rescue them. As they climbed aboard, Kavanaugh and Kylie noticed women wearing dresses with aprons and work boots. It was a Soviet crew. At the height of the Cold War, when the U.S. Coast Guard had never come to their rescue, it was ice traders aboard a Soviet ship who saved them. They were offered warm clothes and medical care. That very night, the Coast Guard finally arrived and took them to a hospital. The temperature had dropped to below freezing. They wouldn't have survived another night. The 5 days that Deborah, Kylie, Mark Adams, Brad, Captain John Lippeth, and his girlfriend Meg Mooney spent in the ocean were enough to completely alter the course of their lives. Kylie and Brad, the only survivors, were deeply impacted by the psychological trauma. It took years for Deborah to stop hearing the screams of her friends being attacked. She married twice and had 2 children. However, her life was marked by a cruel irony. Her son drowned at the age of 23. At 54, Kylie passed away in her home in Mexico, but the cause of her death was never revealed. When Kavanaugh learned of Deborah's death, he was deeply shaken. Although Kylie's obituary did not mention the cause of death, he recalls hearing whispers among the family, suggesting the possibility of suicide. Brad realized that Deborah never stopped torturing herself, constantly remembering all the terror they had endured. And perhaps the early death of her son also weighed heavily on her. In 2005, Kylie and Kavanaugh appeared together on an episode of the show I Shouldn't Be Alive on the Discovery Channel, where they shared their survival story. Despite the traumatic experiences, Kavanaugh returned to the sea as a professional yachtsman. To this day, he remains determined to find out why the Coast Guard never came to save them.